Alright, well, crap, they got us. Season 1 of House of the Dragon, flawed though it was, overall surpassed collective expectations and certainly my own, and for the eon of waiting time between seasons, I was genuinely very excited to get back into Westeros this year, expand the map, heighten the stakes, deepen the tension, and enjoy the fantasy, but here we are, my joy has turned to ashes in my mouth, and while nothing will ever surpass the horrors of Game of Thrones Season 8, Season 2 of House of the Dragon was manifestly a giant letdown. And we know the problem. It's not the set or the visuals, those remain absolutely stellar. I mean, the show looks incredible, and with all the dragon work, that was a tall order. And I won't pretend that I love every performance this season, but it's certainly not the cast's fault either. It's the story writing. And there's plenty to pick apart, so many strange choices week by week, but this video will cover a small range of issues that all tie back to one writing tool in particular, and that's perspective. To feature just how significant perspective is, I'll be comparing House of the Dragon Season 2 to Game of Thrones pretty heavily, but in doing so, I want to be clear that my issue here with the writing isn't as simple as the dialogue isn't as good, although that's true too. Perspective has to do with how the story is oriented, how the narrative is structured, and perhaps most importantly, how we the audience are managed in relation to that story. If you are new to the channel, please do subscribe for more storytelling deep dives like this, and if you're already a subscriber, thank you and welcome back. So you wouldn't guess it, based on the tone of the characters all acting like they're on the precipice of war instead of in the middle of it, but this is it, guys. We're in the middle of the grand, epic Dance of Dragons, the famed historic civil war between factions of Targaryens representing Rhaenyra for Team Black and Aegon II for Team Green. Spoilers ahead for the first 2 seasons of House of the Dragon, as well as the main runtime of Game of Thrones, though I'll really be focusing on the first few seasons of Game of Thrones because we just don't talk about the later ones. And I know Game of Thrones was not perfect. I think House of the Dragon has actually made some interesting improvements, but when it came to story organization, early Game of Thrones was just utterly pristine. And yeah, in many ways, the show writers there had a much easier job working on that series than they do here. So before we compare that use of perspective, it's worth establishing some of the adaptive challenges in House of the Dragon and how they led to some of the issues we encountered this season. Game of Thrones was, of course, closely based on the A Song of Ice and Fire book series. Those are written in third-person narration, but they hop around point-of-view characters. So as the plot sprawls around the world, we're following, as readers, particular character journeys in live time. The panoply of POV characters serve as our narrative lenses and give us consistent, grounded perspectives into the world at large. Particularly in the early books, these POV people are typically characters we root for, even if they're dislikable at times. House of the Dragon, however, is based on several dozen pages of fire and blood, which is honestly hardly a novel. It's more like a bonus material book within this established story universe. It's written as if by a maester, piecing together at times competing and often amusing accounts of what did or might have gone down during the Targaryen dynasty, and as such, it reads less like an organic story and rather like a list of events patched together by unreliable narrators. That's a feature, not a bug, that's the point. And personally, when I was reading it, I wasn't particularly hooked, rather mildly curious about how these awful people might all kill each other. The literary value of Fire and Blood is less about plot and characters and more about playing around with the concept of narration and history itself. I mean, on the plus side, these show writers have a definitive end to work towards, hooray, and their job is really to flesh out the intricacies of the story beyond the textual skeleton of the main plot points. Because there are competing narratives, because the history of the dance is written with conjecture and exaggeration, they also have plenty of latitude to play around with what exactly happens here. And that's where things start to get a little murky in this show adaptation. The show clearly tries to sort of have its cake and eat it too when it comes to that historical ambiguity. Sometimes the record is set straight, particularly in Season 1. We got definitive answers to things that are a little more open-ended in the book, but sometimes we're left in the dark about what Daemon said or didn't say, or how certain couplings happened. And in Season 1, that made a lot more sense, right? We were taking big time leaps and obviously hurrying along, sort of setting the table. It could have been a bold choice to continue to do that, to go all in on replicating the ambiguity of Fire and Blood. This could have been almost a puzzle box show where we, the audience, are led to disagreements over whose claim about what happened is reliable. That would have been very tricky to write, but as we'll see, their choice to instead randomly lean into that uncertainty while largely maintaining an adherence to intimate certainty was a recurrent issue this season, and it didn't make as much sense because now we're operating in live time in a much more supposedly organic fashion. But another core challenge to that adaptation is that this Dance of Dragons does not actually, in Fire and Blood, unravel that organically at all, nor is there much by the way of dialogue or intimate characterization. But every writing challenge is also a writing opportunity, and I know people are quick to excuse show writers when they run out of George R.R. Martin's dialogue to nab, but let's just remember that even in Season 1 of Game of Thrones, there were plenty of scenes written purely for the show, and some of them were absolutely fantastic.
5. 1. One army, a real army, united behind one leader with one purpose. Our purpose died with the Mad King.
Thoughtful adapters are more than capable of writing meaningful scenes and using subtext, something painfully absent this season. Finally, a major challenge for this season of House of the Dragon was actually made by the show itself rather than the source material. So stories are typically kicked off with an inciting incident, the first domino that falls and sets off a big web of action. Season 1 of Game of Thrones, very simple. The death of Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King, prompts King Robert to head north and ask Ned to be Hand, and we ride from there. On we go. But crucially, great stories don't just move us forward in time, they also move us back, adding a key layer of intrigue for the characters and, crucially, for us, the audience. It might seem like we're joining the story just at its start, but we're actually jumping into the middle of something already thorny and complicated. Through the narrative, the past is unfolded right alongside the future. Ned is actually a detective in Season 1, retracing Jon Arryn's steps and uncovering the truth of Joffrey's birth. We also learn more and more about the past of the Night's Watch, Robert's Rebellion, and the Targaryens. This adds layers and layers of pivotal intrigue. Right when we meet Robert and Cersei, for example, we know something about their marriage is off, but we don't know what. Intrigue. We know there's a mysterious story behind Jon Snow's mother. Intrigue. We know some people think Jon Arryn was murdered. Intrigue. And look, I really enjoyed Season 1 of House of the Dragon. I don't mean to wish it away, but it did render explicit all of the backstory behind this civil war. There's not really any room for intrigue, and the few chances that they had this season to manufacture some via new characters like Jane Arryn or Cregan Stark were really weirdly and kind of sadly hurried over. Absolutely everything significant was explained and shown to us last season. So there's no mystery behind why Otto and Alicent have tension, or how Aemond lost an eye, or why Daemon is so angsty. It's all been laid bare. And look, again, that was a very enjoyable prologue season, just as I'm sure it would have been very enjoyable to start Game of Thrones with Robert's Rebellion, but that would have killed the chance for major reveals like Jon Snow's heritage, as well as smaller flashes of character complexity that keep us hooked on who these people are and what they might do next. On top of that, there's also no real one inciting incident. That's by design here. The idea is that this horrid history just sort of tumbles into itself and no one knows exactly when or how it started. And that's a neat concept. It's probably truer to real life. But Christ, it's sort of weird to see royals dying and armies marching and dragons flying and still feel like we haven't started yet. As for that intrigue, this show chooses to manufacture mystery instead by cutting away during crucial dialogue or jumping past crucial developments. And this takes me to what I think is the major writing flaw throughout House of the Dragon. All of these writing challenges circle back to the show's utterly mismanaged use of perspective. Again, where A Song of Ice and Fire followed a handful of POV characters that the show adhered to very closely, Fire and Blood's historic perspective lacks ready-made launches for obvious, consistent narrative lenses. That, however, is no excuse or reason not to develop some, and Season 1 was pretty heavily Rhaenyra's story, with some comparative flashes of Alicent's, but Season 2 really mismanaged their options on both a micro and a macro level, and it drastically weakened the potential poignancy of the season as a whole. This video will cover why perspective matters, how maneuvering perspective switches is a pivotal part of a show managing its relationship to the audience, and then how one Season 2 mini-plot demonstrates just how badly that perspective was fumbled. So enough preamble, we've had enough preamble this year, let's jump in.
Do you accept me as your queen and ruler? Or do you cling even now to what you think you lost?
So the show writers have said a few times now that this grand sweeping war really comes down to Rhaenyra and Alicent's personal journeys. And honestly, whether or not you think that angle is compelling is kinda neither here nor there because it's not really what we get. They each get plenty of screen time, sure, but we don't follow either of these women consistently or organically enough to feel sufficiently grounded in their emotional lives and dramatic tension. Throughout the season, we hop all over the place. This show's approach to perspective is entirely undisciplined, so on Team Green alone, we've got Alicent, Aemond, Aegon, Helena, Kristen, both Lannister twins, all as narrative lenses from time to time. That's a fair few, and that can be fine, but the jumps in focus are here used to maximize communicative efficiency rather than to escalate dramatic tension. The show has us see things happen just because we need to know that those things happened. And this is rather like just listing events that occurred rather than dramatizing history through narrative and storytelling. And again, this adaptation isn't really replicating that history genre of the source text. The scope is often deeply intimate, and we, the audience, are frequently privy to incidents that no historian could have captured. And as we witness this war, despite that supposed intention of making it about two women, we're not really following any one person's journey. And though there are some spectacular performances this season, in my opinion, the biggest standout being Emma Darcy, shout out to them, we're not really anchored in anyone's emotions enough for the ostensibly high material and emotional stakes of this war to manifest personally. In contrast, in Game of Thrones Season 2, we continue to follow the same POV mainstays of Season 1 while also adding Davos Seaworth to the roster. Each character is a crucial lens into a strand of plot and/or a key location. It's not super strict. We sometimes get the occasional scene without a POV character when we need to know something that none of these people are privy to. And again, this is not first-person perspective. We're not in these people's heads. We're sitting on their shoulders, and they serve as our guides throughout the world of Westeros. So the first thing to note about the power of strong use of perspective is pretty simple, and that's reliable perspective provides structural solidity to the show that paves the way for both good world building and raising the stakes, two crucial necessities for audience engagement. So in Game of Thrones, in just the first episode of Season 1, we both learn and we feel that it's a big deal that the Honorable Ned Stark has a bastard. This is key. Obviously, the dynamics of the Stark family matter to us. Jon's parentage is ultimately the heart of the whole story, or it should have been. And more simply, the concept of a bastard is absolutely pivotal to the core drama in Season 1. The significance of bastards isn't plainly announced to us. It's a piece of world building that we feel, not just know, but feel through following the perspectives of a few Stark characters and, of course, Jon Snow. And by having consistent POV characters, we know after each episode what we might see during the next. It's such a simple concept that was completely missing in House of the Dragon. On a very plain level, that just keeps us curious, but it also raises the emotional stakes of the show. So, when Ned Stark dies, we're not just sad because it's unjust, we're not just bummed out that he won't be on our screens anymore, we're impacted through our web of POV characters. And because the show is consistent in checking in with each of them, we know that we'll see someone like Robb react, we'll see Catelyn react. We sort of dread it, but we're excited for it all at once, and we therefore care about major developments more. Without those consistent perspective characters, the only perspective with which I absorb things is my own, and that unfortunately makes it a lot easier to notice flimsy world building. So, halfway through this season of House of the Dragon, Team Black decides to find some riders for the dragons that live at their headquarters.
It's a mad sword.
Okay, but Season 1 ended with Daemon poetically waking up Vermithor, and now you're telling me that there are even more unclaimed ones on Dragonstone, and you've sent away the only rider who lacks a dragon, and you're just thinking of this now? I know, there are explanations within this story universe that the show hastily scrambles to communicate, but we only receive that information once we've already needed it. When Rhaenyra tells Jace that getting new riders is madness, it might make sense to her, but I haven't been rooted in her perspective, and from my own lens, it doesn't sound like madness, it sounds super obvious. If I were staring down a huge dragon-oriented war, and I'm sitting on a handful of latent powerhouse dragons, even if I'm pursuing deterrence or whatever, activating every dragon I can find is my first order of business. That seems obvious to me. And that retrospective exposition, the explanations that the show gives, are all fine. This isn't a big plot hole or anything. But as they frame this pursuit of new riders as utterly groundbreaking, I don't agree. I'm not feeling the big dramatic payoff of this development that the show clearly needs me to. And quite unlike Game of Thrones, when major characters in House of the Dragon die, I have no idea if we're going to see any reactions. They might even be quite moving scenes, but the emotional stakes of the show are inherently lowered if I as the audience can't anticipate emotional consequences week by week. And it doesn't have to be a death. As another example, we see Gwaine Hightower recognize that something is going on between Criston Cole and Alicent. In Game of Thrones, we could start to predict how this might have some consequences, right? We could anticipate the eventual payoff. But here, episodes later, we randomly cut to Gwaine just drawing his sword at Cole and yelling about it out of absolutely nowhere. And I don't know this guy well enough to understand why he cares or what he's feeling, and what a shame. I was really excited by this character's potential. And consistent perspective also builds personal connections to focal characters. And beyond the obvious benefits of, feeling engaged with the show, having favorite characters, getting excited about that, these connections are essential for shows to build material significance within their universe. Something might be intrinsically interesting, but it can still ring quite hollow if we're not personally involved with anybody that it affects. And don't get me wrong, I like some of these characters on House of the Dragon, but because we cut away from them so randomly and so frequently, because we skip over certain developments or reactions to things, the connection is very fractured, and I'm therefore judging people and events from my own standpoint. So, for example, this season, J.R.R. was sort of a weird character. He's this really great diplomat, he seems pretty competent, then he starts getting pissy at his mom, but then seems to sincerely want to follow her, great. He then suggests that they find new riders, then gets deeply upset when those riders aren't highborn, as his own legitimacy is threatened, and I actually think Jace could have been a great contender for being a new POV character this season. I would have loved if he hadn't been at Dragonstone until after the Red Sowing. He could arrive back and see this new development. We could have used him as a lens into the North and the rest of Westeros. Or maybe we could have developed his romance with Baela more. I mean, these two have a really nice relationship. And remember, Season 2 of Game of Thrones, we became closer to Robb as we saw his romance with Talisa. We see him in an intimate new setting, and this adds to our emotional purchase with that character. Romance is good, and this season really needed some. But the point here is that though we might like Jace, we're not really emotionally connected to him. We only check in with him haphazardly. So when he gets angry, I don't really care. I would love to feel this development from his standpoint. I'd love to care, but I just see it from mine. And to me, it just sounds irrelevant. I don't automatically care that his legitimacy is threatened. You need to make me care about that by making me care about him. Look at Season 1 of Game of Thrones. I don't automatically care if the son of the king isn't actually the king's son. But who does care? Ned. And he's my guy. Not just because I like Ned, not just because he's a good guy, but because he's my narrative anchor. We make judgments about plot elements and other characters through our narrative perspectives. And the initial introduction of Joffrey is actually a great example. Right away, the Stark kids all hate him except for Sansa. So I learn about Joffrey, I learn about Sansa, I learn about the Starks, there's instant tension. Or take Tywin Lannister. In Season 2, we only ever see him from the vantage points of Tyrion, Jaime, and Arya. He's thereby able to make a bigger impression than if we had met him alone. He's built into something greater than he is. He's formidable and towering and domineering. And this is where limiting our perspective, using discipline with perspective for the audience, really matters. If we were intimately connected to Tywin, he wouldn't work as well. If we saw him taking a bath or crying over his mistakes or tired at the end of a long day, his character presence would falter. Season 1 of House of the Dragon actually did this pretty well with Daemon. So last season, we had a few scenes that followed him, but by and large, he existed in the show through Rhaenyra's eyes. And he was a huge fan favorite because Matt Smith can pull off an enigmatic, charming villain like no one else. This season, though, we spent every week crawling around in his head, and that enigma is shattered. This is true for virtually every character. There's no room this season for imagination or awe or secondhand impressions. It's all laid explicit. This degree of undisciplined perspective intimacy with too many characters both lessens the effects that the characters should have on each other and nulls my ability to invest in any of them in particular. Seeing characters from external perspectives helps make them seem more impressive and inspirational. So Aemond is supposed to be this great sword fighter, Corlys is a master at sea, but we neither see that for ourselves, which is a huge bummer, nor do we see that really mattering or making an impression on other characters. Grounded perspectives also communicate crucial themes of any given show. Using Ned's death as an example yet again, this huge subversion of our expectations gets at the heart of the show's thematic build in those early seasons. Honor won't save you here. When Ned died, I felt personally betrayed by the story, and I'm not expecting that level of subversion here, right? That was amazing and iconic, but rather highlighting it as an example of how Game of Thrones used perspective to create emotional buy-in that was absolutely pivotal to the show's thematic messaging. A lot of people this season got pretty frustrated at the show's recurring focus on war being bad for the common folk, and I get it. I mean, I don't think that Fire and Blood, beyond playing around with the idea of archives and history, actually has much of a point beyond being entertaining, and that's fine with me. I can understand, though, why the show writers felt the need to include this theme, but man, this is a problem I see in shows all the time, assuming the audience will care about something in the show universe just because we probably care about it in our universe. It's not an automatic translation, though. Like the idea of Bastards, I'm only invested if I believe that characters I'm invested in also care. This season gave us half-baked subplots regarding the famine in King's Landing, but they sidestep the political intricacies of, for example, Rhaenyra providing relief through her own blockade, or Aegon over-promising royal resources. And more importantly, when Rhaenyra says over and over that she doesn't want to destroy innocent lives, I don't actually believe her. Contrast this to Daenerys. Even in only seasons 1 and 2, we've been anchored in her POV for long enough to know her values. We've lived with her perspective. We felt the things she felt. Her setbacks were our setbacks. The show paints Rhaenyra as both eminently concerned with avoiding violence and possessing this godlike superiority over everyone. And it's fine that she's both, that's fine. But because we see it from the outside in, rather than feeling it from the inside out, that doesn't land as complexity, it lands as confusion. And the idea that propaganda over the small folk will win this war is likewise unconvincing because it's so sporadic and disjointed from the actual action. And the show really needs us to care about civilians. So in the finale, Aemond burns down a city. We see it happening from his POV, we have no idea what the hell is happening or where we are, and we find out later that this was actually a huge deal. First of all, wrong order. And secondly, I still don't care about this city in the slightest. Sure, I am nominally against burning civilians here because I'm against burning civilians in real life, but that's not enough for me to feel impacted emotionally here. And I also don't care materially. The show didn't bother to establish what Sharp Point was, that's the name of the city in case you didn't know, and why its destruction was so meaningful. But the whole finale actually revolves around it. That Aemond burned it down changes everything for Alicent, Rhaenyra, and Aegon. It's framed like Aemond is on this horrific revenge rampage that's shocking everyone. But despite how important his character is, I don't actually know Aemond well enough to process this as a snapping moment for him. To me, it actually seems quite on brand, and instead of feeling the weight of this city burning, I just absorb that it occurred and then wait to find out why the hell it matters. Somewhat similarly, Criston Cole has a big moment in the finale where he waxes poetic about the futility of his own war. And though he's been on my screen plenty this season, we haven't been following his perspective consistently enough for this to feel like a dramatic change. I know he used to be super confident as a commander. I understand that this is a new attitude. But this ostensibly key development was super inorganic. When he earlier asked for Alicent's favor, it felt like an odd power play, and now he's reiterating what sounds like genuine love for her. He's depressed because, under the tyranny of dragons, his sword is now meaningless, but I literally haven't seen him use it in years. So it sounds nice, this is decent dialogue, a lot of people liked this scene, but to me it landed very hollow, and this moment of payoff just didn't register. If the show is going to focus on the horrific futility of war, it's paramount that we feel it in our bones, not just hear about it from half the characters. And, at some point, if none of them believe in what they're doing, then why should I? Finally, this lack of consistent perspective hampered the show's emphasis on Aegon's prophecy. And that's a whole other video, right? But remember early Game of Thrones? Even in the first episode, we developed a solid understanding of who believed in White Walkers and who didn't. And because we, the audience, knew that they're real, we have to live in that increasing dramatic irony. Season 1 of House of the Dragon made strong juxtaposition between Viserys and Daemon's attitudes towards dreaming. This season, though, it's very unclear who believes what. Rhaenyra tells Jace that she hadn't told him about the prophecy yet because she didn't believe it herself. That's really huge, and there are moments where she seems to focus more on how it grants her a divine right than how she's supposed to save lives, but the show doesn't really do anything with that. And despite our opening at the wall, Jace doesn't seem to connect the very obvious dots. Helena goes from vague premonitions to direct clairvoyance. Aemond holds the prophetic dagger to no end other than Alicent noticing. Daemon sees the future and understands himself as a character within a story. And as a side note, anytime characters acknowledge that they're in a story, it's a sign of a desperate writer's room. But that aside, clearly, the thematic element of differing levels of knowledge could have been monumental this season, but instead it was painfully scattered and haphazard. And all of these half-baked thematic efforts this season actually could have, I think, worked fine, if not really well, if the show had taken more care in consistently grounding the emotional and material stakes of the narrative through reliably steady POV characters on both sides of the conflict.
I cannot promise to make you happy, but I ask you, make this sacrifice willingly. For all of us.
How you tell your story is just as important as what story you choose to tell, and when you have a range of POV characters like we do here, choices of when and where to switch from one perspective to another can build up a compelling relationship between audience and show. It's all about when we receive information, what we're led to focus on, and how we feel dramatic payoff. In Season 2 of Game of Thrones, one of our POV characters, Arya, is stuck at Harrenhal, and she winds up being cupbearer to none other than Tywin Lannister. And look, this is a show invention, lest anyone say that only George can write this stuff. It's not in the books. It's super fun, but it's not just there for the hell of it. We see a new side to both these characters, they challenge each other, there's some degree of intriguing mutual respect, and it makes for captivating television because it's obviously so risky for Arya, and we're rooting for her, but we also hang on to every last word Charles Dance delivers. Plus, in one scene, they throw in Littlefinger, and so now we have a moment where Arya is avoiding being recognized by someone who knows what she looks like, Littlefinger is scheming away politically, and Tywin is planning his next battle maneuver. This is very simple sleight of hand. Our hearts are racing as we hope our POV character stays safe, but in the background, we can hear Littlefinger suggest to Tywin that the Lannisters team up with the Tyrells. Tywin then leaves Harrenhal shortly thereafter, and the next time we see him, he's saving King's Landing with the Tyrells. The House of the Dragon storytelling approach probably wouldn't have bothered using Arya as a narrative lens here. We probably would have just been privy to Tywin's meeting with the Tyrells. But Game of Thrones deprives us of that scene intentionally. We then watch Stannis' siege of King's Landing from the perspectives of Tyrion, Sansa, and briefly Cersei, and we're distracted by all of their action. So on a first watch, we've forgotten about Tywin's meeting with Littlefinger, and we then get to experience some genuine surprise. This is really clever perspective maneuvering, and the reason they do it is for us. They sneak in build-up and delivered payoff to keep the show engaging and surprising. Furthermore, because we do experience that siege from the viewpoint of the sieged, even though the Lannisters are the show's bad guys, Tywin's heroic arrival washes over us like relief. Perspective can make us subconsciously align ourselves with characters we nominally root against, or on the flip side, we can also agonize alongside good characters as they make hard decisions or do bad things. Game of Thrones was never shy about making it clear who the good guys and bad guys were, but with flashes of complexity and with carefully maneuvered perspective, the show challenged absolutist morality and showed that good people can do bad things and vice versa. House of the Dragon is predicated on a similar idea, right? That both sides of this war are in shades of moral gray. But their method of creating that moral ambiguity is by creating confusion, rather than using clever perspective angling to make us sympathize with both parties. They even could have switched episode by episode, green versus black. That might seem a little cheesy, but it could have given us something to anticipate week by week at least. As another fun comparative example, in Season 1 of Game of Thrones, Robb Stark is presented with a decision. He can use his 20,000 men to attack either Jaime's army or Tywin's army. Just as he's deciding, a Lannister scout is revealed, and to the shock of his cohort, Robb decides to release the scout to send a menacing warning to Tywin.
Tell Lord Tywin, winter is coming for him. 20,000 Northerners marching south to find out if he really does shit go.
It's played off as a character moment, and that's that. Later, we sit in Tyrion's perspective as he and Tywin's army await battle. When the 20,000 Starks attack, Tyrion gets knocked out, misses the show, and awakes to a blatant Lannister victory. Just as we, the audience, are realizing that that means our hero Robb must have lost, we get a game-changing reveal.
The scouts were wrong. There were 2,000 Stark bannermen, not 20.
Did we get the Stark boy at least?
He wasn't here.
Where was he?
With his other 18,000 men.
It's a major plot moment, right? The huge war is moving along, and this simple perspective maneuver makes it 10 times more surprising, interesting, and engaging. Robb and Tyrion are both narrative lenses. The writers switch around which one they use to play with our expectations and create wonderful emotional payoff. And again, we care about both sides, and both sides have complex morality. Robb just sent 2,000 men to their deaths, but it's for a righteous cause. Are we okay with that? I'd argue that that decision alone is a far more poignant insight into the horrors of war than a full season of House of the Dragon characters stating aloud that war is no good. Now, to be fair, there's at least one decent example of solid perspective maneuvering in House of the Dragon. It's sorta too little too late, but it's when Daemon decides to fall in line behind Rhaenyra in the finale. This is one of the very few beats of that episode that had my full attention. We last saw Daemon presented with a dilemma, we then switch to Rhaenyra rolling up to confront him, and when we see him, even though it's pretty obvious what he's going to decide to do, it still feels like real relief to watch him bend the knee. Plus, we finally got to see someone do something they're good at. This was just a strong, energizing moment overall. It is, however, the exception rather than the rule here. House of the Dragon is consistently pretty lousy at playing around with what we know and expect, and annoyingly, again, its biggest trick in trying to manufacture strong audience payoff is in cutting away at pivotal moments and then speeding ahead to what's presented as a dramatic reveal. And look, sometimes that can work. Sometimes, but using that trick over and over inherently disrupts my ability to forge a personal connection with any of these characters, something the show desperately needs us to have. Season 1 gets a pass here in my books because we had to jump forward in time so much, but for example, Season 2 opens with this pretty big reveal that Alicent and Criston Cole are hooking up. This is an incredibly cheap form of surprise. Hey, look what's happening, bet you didn't see that coming. But this season, it's pretty crucial that the audience be deeply invested in Alicent's emotional state of being. And when you cut us out of these pivotal developments, I can't see the world from her perspective. I can't feel the things she feels. I can only judge her from my own perspective, and I'm sorta confused. Smaller decisions, like cutting to Rhaena running around during the finale, then also stand out as utterly bizarre. You know, in this case, from our standpoint, Team Black has plenty of dragons now. I don't really care about this person. I like her fine, I guess, but this isn't something we need to see. And if we are gonna see it, what a wasted opportunity to contrast her naturalist hunt for Sheepstealer with the brutal forced red sowing. And it is also overall just bizarre to chuck in this narrative lens without really developing this character. I don't know her well enough to care if she dies of thirst. And hey, this was another big missed opportunity, right? And it fits into this broader theme of House of the Dragon presenting us with plain information that we need to have instead of working crucial developments through meaningful storytelling structures. Here, we had a young princess whose betrothed sweet prince was just murdered. She's been overlooked her whole life. She's sent away to a castle on a faraway mountain where her host is interesting but maybe hostile, and though she's never succeeded before, she decides to try to tame a never-before-ridden dragon. I mean, come on, that's a whole film of its own, but they don't bother throwing in any obstacles that she needs to overcome, any backstory for the Veil for her to discover, any reason why she in particular might be able to tame this dragon. I know we have time constraints, but man, this was frustrating. But I think the most telling example of mismanaged perspective overall is in the blood and cheese incident, so let's look at that now.
What's happened?
They killed the boy.
Blood and Cheese is the bookish reference to the brutal assassination of the young boy J.R.R. And the book account is actually even more grisly than the show depicts. I'm not saying it was a pleasant scene, but in the book, Helena is tormented and threatened while Alicent is forced to watch, and it destroys both of these characters. So after resisting their tormenting for a while, Helena eventually obeys their orders to choose one of her children to die, and these assassins seem to take some sort of glee in then killing the other one. Here, they just need Helena to identify the boy. Even with the idea that history distorts reality, this adaptation felt like a very strange choice, but putting that aside, let's look at how this incident unfolds for us. Now, remember, Season 1 ended with Rhaenyra hearing about Luke's death and giving us a ferocious glare that seemed to indicate the war was really starting. Season 2 begins with Rhaenyra absent from her council as she searches for Luke's remains, and to shut Daemon up, Rhaenys gives a pretty compelling little speech about the significance of grieving and why it's good that Rhaenyra is doing this in the long run. Then, of course, having grieved, having returned, Rhaenyra makes a rash decision and says she wants Aemond, obviously pursuing revenge, just as she would have at the end of Season 1. And I'm mentioning that because it's just a clear example of needlessly sloppy writing. Rhaenys is a blatant mouthpiece of authorial messaging this season, so okay, we're supposed to understand that grief is a powerful thing to experience. I agree, but then Rhaenyra has just about the same reaction that I imagined she would have had before she mourned Luke. It's not a huge plot hole or even disastrous writing, but it speaks to how the show communicates its ideals to us. Characters just announce them, the narrative doesn't dramatize them, and the gap between those two makes for some confusion as all these well-intended people wage a bloody war. But here we go. This is all Daemon needed to hear to get going on his own vengeful agenda. Remember, earlier this episode, he wanted to fly with Rhaenys and just attack Aemond and Vhagar together at King's Landing. Now, though, he's scrapped that plan and decides to engineer a covert break-in at King's Landing. Here, our location is Dragonstone, which is Team Black headquarters, and we're sitting on Daemon's shoulder as he organizes the break-in through Missaria. We've had flashes of scenes with him as our narrative lens before, but we can clearly see that he's starting to be a real anchor this season. He then meets with Blood and Cheese, and they get their assignment to kill Aemond. The assassins in this scene have just one follow-up question: what if we can't find him? I'm about to sound quite pedantic, but I don't care. This drove me nuts. Look, in our world, in reality, that's a reasonable question. But in reality, we'd also ask at least a dozen more, right? What if we're caught? Who should we say sent us? Should we kill anyone else while we're at it? It's just such a stupidly selective, pragmatic concern that Rhaenyra also echoes later.
If Aemond was not to be found, what were your instructions then?
It's just such a sticky line. What made her think of that? What made them think of that? It's not a huge deal, but it's a seam that reveals shoddy stitching. And of course, famously, we don't hear Daemon's response. We are left to wonder ourselves whether he said, oh, well, then just forget about it, trot along home, or if he uttered the episode title, Get a Son for a Son. It's a clear callback to Season 1, when Daemon is accused of toasting Viserys' dead baby as the heir for a day, but we don't know whether he did or not then. The difference, though, is again that Daemon was intentionally enigmatic last season. This season, he's a huge POV character. We're privy to the inside of his brain. He's wrestling all season with guilt, and it also seems unavoidably true that he did indeed order this baby's death, so why hide it from us? This is the show trying to have its cake and eat it too when it comes to the ambiguity of history. Did Daemon explicitly order the murder? Ooh, we'll never know, but we will know deeply intimate things like what he dreams about, and our relationship with this major character is therefore oddly fractured and inconsistent. And moreover, our relationship to the narrative of the Dance of Dragons is oddly inconsistent too. We have access to the deepest of truths that don't make it to the history records. We hear private reflections, and then randomly, pivotal moments are obscured as they are in history. Well, we then carry on following the assassins as they stroll through the castle, and it's way too easy for them, right? People this season filter in and out of high-security locales with so much ease, but even putting that aside, this is another fumbled perspective choice. While there's plenty of more violence to come, Blood and Cheese is easily the scariest thing that happens this season, but it's made completely unscary and unserious because we see it from their perspective rather than from the victims. The dumb dialogue has given away that they're not gonna find Aemond, and man, if their conversation with Daemon had been written with a little more care, we could have been actually surprised and alarmed when we realize Aemond isn't where he's supposed to be. Instead, we know in advance. But it seems even more obvious to me that we should have seen this unfold from, I suggest, Alicent's point of view. Again, in the book, Alicent is there too, and it obviously traumatizes her. And if not Alicent, then perhaps Helena. It's just such a wasted opportunity to build horrific suspense, to make us scared and on the edge of our seats and sympathetic to Team Green. I mean, in the show, Helena just isn't a dragon rider, though she's claimed one of the oldest dragons. In the book, this trauma indelibly disables her, and they could certainly stick with the dreamer route and have her unwilling to fight because she knows won't make a difference, fine, but at least let us experience her pain and loneliness, even through Alicent's eyes. We could then know the impossibility of Aemon's command to her in the finale, rather than being left to wonder, again from our own perspectives, why Helena even has a dragon if she has no interest in riding it at all. And this execution of the execution is also a wasted opportunity to play around with dramatic irony. The Greens didn't know a break-in was coming, but we did, and we could be forced to sit with that, and that dread could be scary and engaging and memorable. It's not complicated, it was right there, and it's utterly confusing to me that they actively sidestepped an obvious opportunity for poignant dramatic suspense and for making characters on both sides of this war seem sympathetic and meaningful. And a good story should feel like if you removed one thread, the whole tapestry would unravel. And the brutal murder of a young heir is a heck of a story thread, but what would really change if we removed it? No one is fundamentally altered by this moment, no one suffers any consequences. We do get the Bracken Blackwood echo of it, but they were gonna fight anyway. Overall, you'd be forgiven for forgetting that this happened in the first place. There are so many comparative examples from early Game of Thrones, but a great one is the sheer idea that King Robert might have had the adolescent Daenerys killed. As the new Hand of the King, Ned is appalled that Robert would even consider killing an innocent child, and again, perspective switches here flesh out the dynamics of this story world. We know Daenerys, now we know why she matters so much, and we can feel the peril that she's in. But at the same time, Ned is discovering that his old friend has become paranoid and vicious and violent. This development is part of why Ned later decides to warn Cersei before he tells Robert the truth about Joffrey's birth, since he knows Robert will show no mercy. This whole plot later reemerges as we learn more about Varys and Jorah, but even just in Season 1, remove this conversation and we lose the whole plot. You really cannot apply the same detailed scrutiny to House of the Dragon. That example was just talking about having someone killed. Blood and Cheese is the horrific beheading of a royal toddler. It's pretty absurd that this murder ultimately just doesn't matter. No new obstacles, no new motivations, it's all swiftly forgotten. And if this fallen domino sets off emotional strands rather than material ones, then it's all the more important that we absorb the horror and sadness from the perspectives of the victims. Overall, and as exemplified by the Blood and Cheese affair, House of the Dragon's approach to storytelling was clearly oriented around efficiently communicating events to us. In other words, just showing us shit because it happened. And maybe you're fine with that, maybe it worked for you, but this approach is certainly a major reason why so many fans walked away from this season utterly disappointed and disengaged.
Villains! Fire from the sky! This is war! I declare war!
So I've been comparing the two, but I am aware that there was no chance House of the Dragon would be as multifaceted as Game of Thrones. But just think of that simple perspective maneuver from the Game of Thrones Season 2 Siege of King's Landing, in contrast to the nonsensical blundering of that Blood and Cheese example. They chose to focus on just showing us what happened and really failed to emphasize the emotional takeaways that we could and should have had. And that's the consistent issue with House of the Dragon Season 2. I see it, I get it, the episode ends, and I forget it. I know people have plenty of qualms with the content of this season. Personally, though, even if it's not exactly how I imagined things, I don't really take any serious issue with choices around what happened. I think even the bolder changes and some of the weirder moves could have worked. It's more about how it was presented to us. And I know that the writers this season were dealt a rough hand, not just the writers' strike, but the absolutely confounding corporate decision to cut this season down from 10 planned episodes to 8. That's ridiculous. However, the reason I started this video with a discussion of the source material is that I'm confident that even in 10 episodes, this season would have felt unengaging and bizarre, because this misuse of perspective comes down to a mishandling of the process of adaptation itself. Moving this story from the medium of a fictional retrospective history book to a live-action television series required a thoughtful approach to reorienting how both the plot unfolds and how the audience is engaged. We instead dive sporadically in and out of intimate scopes with any given character, and nothing feels organic or meaningful. If the writers were instead forced to make the difficult but necessary decisions about whom we regularly view from the inside out and whom we can only see from the outside in, they'd also be forced to improve the world building, the material stakes, and the thematic messaging. So basic things like the death of Sunfire or Alicent's decision to sacrifice her son, these are huge, game-changing developments, and I know most people hated the Alicent move, but I personally think it could have been fantastic if it had followed a more natural and consistent progression. Likewise, for the apparent death of the beloved Dragon of the King, the model for Team Green's sigil, fractured perspective also leads to fractured lore, a poorly made fantasy world. I mean, do these dragons matter here or not? In general, a good test for whether narrative twists and turns like that work is if they afterwards seem utterly inevitable, even if they took you by surprise at first. We shouldn't end an episode wondering why Rhaenys turned back around towards death. We should feel like the moment she rode to battle, her fate was sealed. And I know that there are explanations for all of these bewildering moments. Week by week, podcasts and articles and breakdowns rolled out, and these content creators often had better interpretations of what's going on than the show did itself, and credit to them for that. But that's the audience inventing, not discovering, and we shouldn't have to Google things after episodes to understand what we were supposed to think and feel about them. And it was pretty hard to swallow the fact that this season's promo materials were more energizing than the show itself. In general, I do prefer morally optimistic shows, but in this universe, and as a deep piece of history predating Game of Thrones, the great Targaryen dynasty, the history of this family that could only be undone by itself, punished by the gods for its vainglorious ambitions, I would much rather watch bad people doing bad things to each other. But if this show interpretation of Fire and Blood is going to insist on reimagining the narrative to reflect good intentions on both sides, to emphasize how misinformation and lack of control caused violence more than anything else, then they absolutely needed to do the legwork of changing not just the substance of the story, but also the form of its delivery. And as for which characters should have served as our narrative lenses, as I said, I do think Jace could have stepped into focus this season, maybe even pushing Rhaenyra into more of a backseat as she becomes increasingly tyrannical and enigmatic or something, but my real need this season was Alicent. Her transformation is the most drastic this season, but to me, she felt the same in every scene, and I never really felt what was changing for her. But before I start ranting about that, I am super curious if you agree that grounded perspectives could have helped this season. What characters do you think would have worked best? Please do comment with your suggestions. If you are someone who felt let down or frustrated by this season, I hope this comparative analysis of perspective in Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon helped explain why. Please don't forget to subscribe, and as ever, thank you so very much for watching.